The Roaring Twenties. Just thinking about the decade brings up mental images of music, dancing, and of course, alcohol. We all know about these connotations, but to truly understand why the 20s are associated this way, we have to travel back a few years. In 1917, the 18th Amendment, also known as the Volstead Act, but most commonly known as Prohibition, was first introduced to Congress, and 2 years later, the bill was passed in October 1919, before the 20s even began. Prohibition would soon be proven to be one of the least approved laws in American history and a violation of human rights. One common misconception about Prohibition was that it was simply when they made alcohol illegal, but more accurately, it prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. And that's a direct quote from the Constitution. This was made as the 18th Amendment, and an amendment by definition isn't simply a change, but it's actually meant to be an objective improvement. Also know that prior to the 18th Amendment, and until this day even, no amendment has ever been ratified except for the 18th Amendment and the prohibition of alcohol. And the idea that this amendment could be ratified was completely overlooked by Congress. The fact that these weren't made into federal laws, but were rather a full-fledged amendment to the first ever government document to inscribe laws, proved that in a way the government was flashy in their act. They knew that America would be rattled by this amendment.
With this being said, two facts have been withheld and are not regularities in Prohibition discussion. Number one, the Volstead Act did not ban the consumption or even private possession of alcohol. Only certain states banned possession of alcohol altogether. And two, this was the first amendment that received a countdown, and a long year's countdown at that. This leaves a lot of wiggle room for alcohol enthusiasts and makes America seem a little reluctant to give up alcohol. In fact, when the amendment passed Congress and went to President Woodrow Wilson, he vetoed the bill, but this veto was overridden by the Senate.
Americans ultimately did not approve of this amendment. When talking about approval versus disapproval, there are two groups that you should know about. One is called the Wets, and the other is called the Dries. The Wets were opposed to Prohibition, and the Dries were generally in support of Prohibition. And the Wets were usually associated with the Democratic Party, and the Dries were usually associated with the Republican Party. One of the major groups that proposed and rallied for Prohibition from the beginning was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or most commonly known as simply the WCTU. Blaming alcohol in general for domestic abuse, however, is considered a bias, and Americans would soon realize it is unconstitutional to create laws based on biases such as these. Many Americans, instead of rebelling or resisting the law, simply chose to ignore it. Speakeasies, or illegal and often hidden bars, sprung up all around the United States, and alcohol was bootlegged across the country and into these bars. Speaking of speakeasies, here behind me is Black Cat Cave. In the 1920s and 30s, it was actually a speakeasy, but it's since been covered in water. People would often illegally pay a fine at restaurants to bring in their own supply of alcohol. The resistance to Prohibition was rapidly spreading.
One negative effect of Prohibition in the United States was the rise of organized crime. As alcohol sales went down, crime rates grew. The law actually created an influx of immigrants from Sicily and Italy to big cities to join family gangs. These were the people who bootlegged alcohol through the country, sometimes killing people in the process.
These gangsters paid police, restaurateurs, and even political figures to keep their affairs quiet. All of this formed because alcohol was made illegal to keep crime rates down and drunks off the street. Probably the most famous of these gangsters was Al Capone. He was a New Yorker born to Italian immigrants who moved to Chicago to build his mafia and smuggle alcohol. He eventually built up the biggest alcohol smuggling gang in the South Side area of Chicago. One instance where people were killed has been named the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. where members of Capone's gang shot and killed 7 members of the rival North Side gang. The North Side gang, led by another famous smuggler, George Bugs Moran, was notorious for hijacking cars of the South Side gang's smuggling operations. There were many other cases of murder in American organized crime. However, this is often deemed the most significant. People were regularly being killed on account of crime to counteract these prohibition laws. All this disapproval proved that prohibition was simply not meant to work out. Many groups started to publicly oppose prohibition, including lifelong non-drinker John D. Rockefeller, who believed that prohibition was causing more crime than it was eliminating. In the beginning of prohibition, he was actually for it. In 1930, bootlegger George Cassidy publicly admitted that he had illegally sold alcohol to members of Congress. He also stated that roughly 80% of Congress drank and were still passing non-drinking laws. This was the tipping point in American disapproval and even in Congress. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt passed a law allowing for beer of roughly 3% alcohol content to be sold, and later that year passed the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. This let the states decide if they wanted to sell alcohol, and since 1966, all states are now wet in selling alcohol. Although all states now sell alcohol, certain counties in some states are still dry, but the wet counties vastly outnumber the dry counties. Prohibition is important in the United States because it proves that if people think a law is unconstitutional, they can resist and work to get the law repealed. 1933 was a great year as it truly showed that natural human rights are to be held up by the government and that humans are collectively responsible for doing so. Prohibition was clearly a violation of human rights and caused way more unnatural crime than it eliminated.
Ross Frontiers,